Hello and welcome to tonight's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. I'm Guy Marzorati, correspondent on KQED's California Politics and Government Desk, and it's my pleasure to introduce our special guest for tonight, Ben Rhodes. Ben is a writer and leading expert on U.S. and global politics. He's a contributor to the New York Times, MS Now, and co-host Pod Save the World. Previously, Ben served as Deputy National Security Advisor to President Barack Obama. His latest book, All We Say, The Battle for American Identity, A History in 15 Speeches, is a sweeping look at the battle over American identity and the questions, what does it mean to be an American and who gets to decide? A reminder, if you have questions for Ben, please submit them in the YouTube chat and we will get to them later in tonight's program. Ben, welcome and congratulations on this book.
Thanks so much, Guy. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah, it's great to be able to chat with you tonight. Let me start off by asking you, you picked 15 speeches across U.S. history for this book. What was kind of the through line and the story that you hope to tell through these speeches and the people who delivered them?
Yeah, so I didn't want to curate the 15 greatest speeches. It's not an anthology. It's meant to be a story about American history, but first and foremost about the different stories that we tell about American identity and what it means to be an American. And I think at the beginning, one of the origin stories of this book for me was dealing with the last 9 years, which have obviously not gone exactly as I would have forecasted them when I was serving in the Obama White House for 8 years. And I came to think of my former boss, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump as exemplifying two very different stories about American identity. Obama's very much, not that Obama's in any way perfect, but that he kind of situates himself in the story of progressive nationalism and progressive exceptionalism, that America was a promise in the Declaration of Independence of equality, and that American history is a story of a struggle to live up to that promise and to close the gap between the reality in this country, which often is not one that makes good on that promise, but that over time, through different movements, the abolitionist movement, the suffrage movement, the movement for workers' rights or women's rights, civil rights, obviously, you're trying to close that gap. Whereas I think Donald Trump represents a different story, which is a more inherited exceptionalism, that there's something inherent in American identity as kind of the recipient of Western supremacy. And it's a white Christian identity in nationalism that other people can be here and can be a part of America, but they're kind of subordinate to a predominant identity. And so when I went back, I wanted to pick speeches that showed different perspectives on this question of what it means to be an American. And I wanted a mix of not just presidents, but politicians and activists and men and women and people of different backgrounds. And also I wanted to space them out so that it does read like a single volume history of the United States, albeit told through these different speeches. And that really was, what guided a year's work. I mean, it took me 4 years to write the book. The whole first year was gathering 100 to 150 speeches and kind of winnowing it down to 15 that I thought could cover enough of the ground to give people a full sense of this debate we've been having.
Yeah. So then you start the book with talking about a speech that J.D. Vance delivered in California, where he is making that argument that America is not necessarily defined by a creed or by an idea, but more of a place or people. That must have been pretty late in your writing process that came about.
That's right. And that speech, it's not one of the 15, right? So each of the 15 chapters, where I spent time with the speaker and their life and what was going on in America at the time and what movements fed into the speech. I had basically nearly completed the work of writing those 15 chapters, but I knew I had to write a prologue that kind of framed the book. And usefully, J.D. Vance gave this speech last year at the Claremont Institute in California, in which he kind of made the argument for me of the alternative American nationalism, the one that I associated with Trump. And J.D. Vance says, in his own words, so this is not me projecting onto him, that America is not a nation that is founded upon a creed. It's not a nation founded specifically, in his words, on that sentence in the Declaration of Independence about all men are created equal. He says that would be far too broad an answer to the question of what does it mean to be an American. And actually, again, very usefully, like I'd framed the whole book around this question, what does it mean to be American? J.D. Vance posed that question in his speech, and he answered it by saying, we're not a creed. He said, we are a particular place with a particular people and a particular way of life. Again, this kind of inherited nationality and identity. J.D. Vance, one of his skills is saying things that I think are controversial in the most inarguable way, right? So who could argue with the idea that we're a particular place and a particular people and a particular way of life? But I actually, as you scrutinize that statement, in my view, it kind of unravels because we are not a particular place. At our founding, we were 13 states on the Eastern Seaboard. I mean, you and I are both in California. This was a distant outpost of the Spanish Empire populated by some indigenous people. I don't think we are a particular people either. If you look around America, you'll find people from everywhere. And frankly, the demographics of America today look nothing like that of the time of the founding. And, the particular way of life, jumps out to me in a way because, we're in the Bay Area. I don't know how many ways of life there are in the Bay Area, but there's far more than one. And actually, like in my judgment, what makes America unique is that you're free to choose your way of life, whatever it may be. And so, however, like I wanted to take it seriously. I obviously don't agree with that perspective, but it is an important part of the American story that there's always been a strain of people that said, no, we are a particular people, and again, it usually is a kind of white Christian identity. That's the identity that is largely going to be celebrated, I think, on the series of celebrations the White House is planning. And so I kind of use that speech from J.D. Vance to set up this argument that there's that strain of American identity and nationalism, and then there's this kind of more progressive evolutionary story that is going to be told in the book by people as different as Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King and Barack Obama and Dolores Huerta. And so it kind of sets in motion the argument that I was trying to show we've been having for the last 250 years.
Yeah, there were strains of that when Vance delivered his RNC speech back in 2024. There were, America is not an idea. I think he said we allow newcomers on our terms. And it was clear like he was making an argument. I think a lot of that was, I was in the arena, it seemed like half the people were almost like, bring back Hulk Hogan. We want more of that. But it was like he definitely saw us make an argument. Where do you see the kind of historical strains of that argument? Like what is Vance pulling from that you looked into for this book?
Well, I think first of all, the starting point of the book is Benjamin Franklin's closing argument on behalf of the Constitution at the Constitutional Convention. And what's interesting about that speech is Franklin does not mention the substance of the Constitution at all. He talks about the virtue of compromise. And he essentially says, look, if you have an assembly of people like we have here today, you get all of their different wisdom, but you also get these different interests and different beliefs, and none of us can get everything we want. And so this is the best we can do. And we should embrace that compromise, stand behind it, and set up a system where we can then debate and work out our differences. And I think what that unlocked for me is the idea that, okay, yes, compromise made this country possible, made the Constitution possible, set up a very successful system of government, if you look at what we've been able to do over 250 years. But we compromised about very big things. Slavery, chief among them at the time, the nature of citizenship, who has access to the full rights of citizenship, the nature of immigration, which was not really, a subject of focus in the Constitution. It was kind of left up to the states to figure that out. And what that kind of showed me is that Um, all the arguments we've been having since are because of the compromises, because we compromised about these issues that had to do with identity. Like, again, who's an American? Who gets to decide that question? And I think that J.D. Vance piece is, if you look early in American history, that was the predominant view, right? White Christian men tended to dominate American politics and society, certainly until the Civil War. They were the only ones who had the right to vote in this country. So actually, the J.D. Vance view was the kind of nature of American political life, at least as it related to rights. And I have, the kind of most virulent form of that in this book, which I'm not suggesting J.D. Vance would agree with entirely, but Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, saying basically the problem with the Constitution is it didn't resolve this issue of slavery the way we would like it to be. It was too close to this aspiration of equality in the Declaration of Independence. And he says, we're here to fix this for all time and say, no, like actually slavery is going to be enshrined in our Constitution. But then what's interesting is, as you continue to travel through American history, there are people that you might not necessarily think of as, a white supremacist like Alexander Stephens was. I have a populist orator named Mary Lease, who gave a very left-wing speech when it came to economics. She talked about this is a government of, by, and for Wall Street. Wall Street owns this country. My kind of inner Bernie Sanders was feeling what she was saying. But at the same time, if you look underneath the surface of what she's saying, she also talked about the need to have a union of the white working class of the North and the South, and to keep immigrants out, and to deny foreigners the right to own land. And she kind of lamented that too much time had been spent during Reconstruction on political rights for Blacks, and actually had some very strange ideas about colonization of Latin America. And so, you start to see, well, wait a second, in populism, there's this strain of, look, we need to kind of protect a certain status for a certain kind of American that tends to exclude non-white Americans. And then, similarly, even a progressive like Louis Brandeis, who I have in this speech, gives a speech defending immigration, but very explicitly European immigration, and then up through Ronald Reagan, obviously, who is probably the closest to Vance, and he gives a speech that is famous for him calling the Soviet Union an evil empire, but it's really a speech about America's Christian identity, and that's what leads to the Soviet Union being an evil empire. It's a godless empire in Reagan's view. So there are these different permutations of the argument. Not everybody says the quiet part out loud. But again, I think if you've lived through American politics in the 21st century, you do see a kind of Christian nationalism or hostility to immigration, or a desire to kind of protect the demographics of the country, kind of reemerging. And J.D. Vance probably does, to your point, talk about that more than some people might be comfortable. And I'm not suggesting that everybody who voted for Donald Trump and J.D. Vance did for that reason. They had other concerns. But I think we, ignored our peril. I mean, look at what ICE has done in our communities. The notion that actually this is a brand of politics that is very familiar if you look at our history.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned the Reagan speech and where he said freedom prospers only where blessings of God are sought. Like, it stood out to me. Maybe it shouldn't have surprised me. Like, so many of these speeches either invoke God or even like pull towards kind of a divine meaning or like direction for the country. What does that say?
I was struck, and I actually haven't been able to, I'm glad you asked this question because, I've been talking about this book a lot and I haven't really put it this way. When I went through this exercise, I was struck by how much I kind of kept bumping into a few different themes, right? One obvious one is race, which we've already talked about a bit. And the only reason I'm not necessarily surprised, but I was writing this book kind of in the backlash to the kind of 2020 post-George Floyd reckoning. And I got to tell you, like, going back and going through the history, race is pretty central to the battles over American identity. Another was immigration. There have been huge fights about immigration throughout our history, and periods of time where we embraced it and periods of time when there are backlashes to it. But also, to your question, religion has been much more central to these arguments and these speeches than I anticipated going forward. I mean, most of these speeches invoke religion in wildly different ways. Progressives or liberals or whatever you want to call it, activists, have often, from Martin Luther King all the way back to, Maria Stewart, the abolitionist in 1830s Boston that I have in here, they are invoking religion as a means of holding America to account. That a just God would not look well upon discrimination or bigotry. But on the other hand, you have a tradition of people kind of invoking God in the sense that America is the manifestation of God's chosen people in a promised land, that we are a Christian nation. We are a city on a hill, if you will. And Reagan, I think in a very powerful way, built this coalition in the Republican Party that was new, that united under one umbrella religious Christian evangelical conservatives with kind of small government, libertarian free market people and national security hawks. And what he's tapping into there in the speech he gave to the National Association of Evangelicals, that's where he gave that speech, and relatively newly politicized Christian evangelicals, he's tapping into that that deep kind of current in American history, that this is essentially the identity of the country is tied up in a kind of Christian inheritance and a Christian identity. And that leads Reagan to make arguments around things like the need to outlaw abortion or the need to have prayer in school and all these kind of culture war issues that we can continue to live with and have been pretty predominant in our politics the last few decades. I think that we make a mistake in thinking that this is new or this is being weaponized or this is kind of novel to a few politicians. No, it's actually kind of been this kind of battle over religion, whether you're embracing a kind of religious identity that is progressive, like we're trying to kind of do what God would intend us to do if he wanted us to, or he or she or whatever you worship as God, how God would want us to treat one another, or whether it's more of, again, a kind of very specifically Christian inherited kind of Western identity. And what was interesting to me about it is that we think of ourselves as being founded upon the freedom of religion, like the idea that everyone can choose how to worship. That's in the Constitution, that's in the Bill of Rights. And yet, religion has played a pretty central role in this debate over identity.
Yeah, I mean, I'd never read Lincoln's second inaugural address before this. I mean, he almost seems to be making an argument. This is towards the end of the war, that like this has happened to us as a country because of what we've done. Like God is doing this. I mean, almost like a karma argument for what we've been through in the Civil War. Yeah, was that surprise? I mean, his language stood out to me. I'd never read that speech before.
So I'd always loved that speech, and I'll get to the speech in a moment, but I'm glad you referenced it because what I did and what I was surprised by is I went back and went through all of Lincoln's writings that I could find and letters and accounts of interactions he'd had. And I really found the religious origins of that speech, but also how deeply Lincoln, who is not like an outwardly pious guy, like he's not someone who went to church every Sunday, but essentially you have to kind of look at it in terms of Lincoln's own wrestling with the issue of slavery, and then Lincoln's own wrestling with the idea of what does God intend here? Because Lincoln starts out as it relates to slavery, and like any politician in his day, this is a dominant issue. He just wants to restrict slavery's spread in the territories, but kind of leave it alone where it is. And when he's elected president in 1860, he says, if I can save the Union without freeing a single slave, that's what I would do. Then he frees the slaves after the Battle of Antietam, but it's kind of framed as a wartime necessity, but as he's going on through the Civil War, he was really wrestling with the question of like, why is this happening? Why is something so apocalyptic and so violent and so awful happening to us? And he used to write these meditations to himself that how baffling it was to Lincoln that both North and South invoked kind of the same God to justify their cause. And the South did invoke religion and the Bible to justify slavery. They found instances in the Bible that suggested that somehow slavery was legitimate, just as the North would invoke the Bible to say slavery was wrong. And Lincoln is beginning to realize that the war and the scale of it has to be about something more than just protecting a political union. And so by 1864, Frederick Douglass, the activist, who's become more pragmatic, he's meeting with Lincoln, but he's been disappointed by Lincoln in past meetings. But he meets with Lincoln in 1864, and Lincoln doesn't think he's going to get reelected at that point because we had not had kind of battlefield breakthroughs yet for the North. That came kind of later in 1864. And Lincoln implores Douglass to tell slaves in the South to come north, just in case he's not reelected and slavery is brought back. He wants to free as many people as he can. And Douglass detects, oh, something is going on inside of Lincoln. I've never seen him like this before. And then by the time he gets to his second inaugural address in 1865, he wants to tell the country what the meaning of this war was. And it is a deeply religious address. He talks about the sin of American slavery. He doesn't call it Southern slavery. And he speaks, I think, what I describe as the most radical sentence ever spoken by an American president. He says, if every drop of blood drawn by the lash, that is the slave owner's lash, must be paid for by a drop of blood drawn by the sword, then the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous. What he's essentially saying is, all these people who have died, and even if more of us have to die, that will be justified to kind of atone for the sin of slavery. And also, it will give us an opportunity to refound the nation on the basis of true equality, essentially resolving the compromise of Franklin and the founders in the other direction. We are now an abolitionist nation. Douglass was in the crowd at the inauguration, and he saw exactly what Lincoln was doing. And he said it was as if he spoke with all the voices of the Hebrew prophets at once. Douglass reacted to it as a religious oration. And then even was able to meet Lincoln that night at the White House. Even after he was thrown out of the receiving line for being black, Lincoln let him back in. And when Lincoln asked him what he thought of the speech, Douglass described it as a sacred effort, a religious effort. And so I think what it really speaks to is that Lincoln needed to find a higher moral basis for determining the meaning of the war and, frankly, the meaning of the United States. And instead of just saying, again, we're great because we're American and the founding fathers were great and they did everything right, he's saying kind of the opposite. He's saying, we really got this wrong at the beginning of this nation. We had to pay the price for that sin. And having paid the price, though, we actually now have an opportunity to forge a just and lasting peace among ourselves, in Lincoln's words. Of course, he did not live much longer after that speech. And in a way, we keep having the same argument. Now, slavery is gone, but then there's segregation. And then, there's a backlash to kind of each progressive movement in our history. But I do think religion, maybe because not that many Americans or as many Americans are personally religious as they have been in past times, we can lose sight of the fact that Americans often were looking to some higher authority or some moral framework to make determinations about what the point of this country is. And Lincoln, I think, did that better than anybody else.
Yeah, I mean, do you see, even in today's politics and today's kind of pluralistic society, do you see untapped potential for political orders to invoke themes of religion or call upon that more in kind of telling the American story?
I do. And I mean, first of all, just, make my first kind of partisan comment here. I don't think Lincoln had in mind that the memorial to him that has the words of the second inaugural carved into it would be the scene of a UFC weigh-in. That's a different way to go. But I think it need not be religious. I do think something that is missing, though, is a moral language. Um, you know, I'll just criticize Democrats here. I remember there was a line, because I think Democrats have been so worried about losing that they're very careful in how they talk, in the era of Trump. And I remember, like, both Joe Biden and Kamala Harris used to use this line about, we need to build an economy that works from the bottom up to the middle out, I'd hear that and think, well, what does that mean? I mean, I know what they're saying. That probably focused group really well. It's, kind of a middle class message. But what's missing in a lot of Democratic rhetoric of the last decade is a kind of moral case. Even Obama, who is not like a personally deeply religious person, he would talk about, in that 2004 convention speech that kind of vaulted him, embracing a politics where, I am my brother's keeper, I am my sister's keeper. That's a religious idea, but it can also be a secular idea, that we care for one another, and I think that we are living at a time when the problems that we're facing they feel so big. The democracy seems to be breaking down. Capitalism doesn't seem to be working. Like, it's hard to believe that your kids' futures are going to be better than yours. We're fighting, multiple wars. Artificial intelligence is kind of coming, and that could take our jobs, or, our kids could be friends with chatbots. I think just talking about your plan for healthcare or your plan for lowering prices, those things are important, but kind of what is sometimes missing in the political storytelling, and speeches are usually the place that you do that, is that sense that there's kind of a moral motivation. This is all about something bigger. It's about something bigger than even affordable healthcare, or bigger even than, like, standing up for the rights of immigrants, or whichever constituency you're focused on. And I do think that Americans are kind of hungry for that. And I hope, and I'm beginning to see some Democrats kind of begin to shift in that direction.
Yeah. You write in the book that speeches that really dive into policy prescriptions can sometimes be the hardest to work on from a speechwriter's perspective. And you highlight both Obama and FDR as kind of particularly adept at explaining and providing context in their speeches. Their old political maxim is like, if you're explaining, you're losing. But
Yes.
somehow both of them, as you write, were kind of master explainers. What to you, how did they do that effectively?
So yeah, they did it in a couple of ways. I mean, let's start with FDR. I think what they both have in common is, and Reagan, I threw him in there too, because this is not restricted to people I agree with. I think the more effective politicians are people who don't just tell you what they want to do, they tell you why they want to do it. So it's not just like a plan. Like, Obama would usually not even get to his plans until, like, well past halfway through the speech. He had to give you the history of the thing he was talking about, and the way he thought about it, and the different things you could do, and then only then could he tell you why he was taking the course he did. And to focus on the two speeches, the one from FDR and one from Obama, and things that illustrate this, FDR's speech that I use is known as the Four Freedoms speech. And this is a speech that he gave in 1941. The U.S. is not in the war yet, but Roosevelt is essentially arguing to an isolationist America First Congress for a blank check of support to Britain. Thus far, we had not given anything like that. And he's arguing for America to ramp up its arms production, and implicitly he's saying we're going to be involved in this war one way or another. And that's not an easy case to make. Now, he thrived on kind of plain spoken explanation, but the other thing that he understood is it's not enough for me to tell them why the isolationists are wrong, why I'm right, why the fascists are bad. He had to give it a bigger meaning. And so the night before the speech, he called in his speechwriters and he says, well, I have an idea for a big ending to this speech. And he dictated to them the four freedoms, which is an idea that had been kicking around in his head. I found, he'd first used it in a press conference, kind of off the cuff, 7 or 8 months earlier. And those are, freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from fear, and fear he defined as aggression, so the fascists, and freedom from want, the idea that everybody should, which was in line with his own New Deal policies, that we should not let people fall behind. And that was so powerful about that is it wasn't enough to kind of make an argument, hey, we have to do this, it's the right thing to do. He elevated the whole cause. And frankly, American identity itself, like this is what we are about. We are about this set of freedoms. It's what distinguishes us from the fascists. It's what binds us together as a diverse citizenry in this nation. And it became immediately a rallying cry. It was on postage stamps. It was on posters. Like, this is what this whole war was about. And those four freedoms end up getting written into the United Nations Charter. Like, they're kind of the cornerstone of the post-World War II order. And so that's a politician who realized, like, I have to go bigger. I have to provide that sense of identity and moral framework to my audience if I'm going to ask them to do hard things. And then the Obama speech I have is kind of shorthanded often as the race speech. It's a speech he gave in 2008 after a series of clips emerged of his pastor, Jeremiah Wright, who'd also baptized his children and married him and Michelle, so they were close. These clips emerged, and some of our viewers may remember, of Reverend Wright saying pretty, derogatory things essentially about America. It's a racist country. It's foreign. 9/11 was chickens coming home to roost for our foreign policy. And I was there at the time, the campaign's losing altitude. We hastily put together this speech for Obama. He stays up the entire night rewriting the speech. I describe getting back, 8-9 pages of track changes. He never did that before or after. And I worked for him as a speechwriter for over a decade. And it was a deeply personal speech. But what he did is, he talked about, I think, the two most important points of the speech. He talked about Reverend Wright as someone who's not just defined by those clips, that this is someone who's a Marine, this is someone who's done wonderful things in his community, and someone who said these things that are very offensive to me and other people. But he said, I can no more disown Reverend Wright than I can disown my white grandmother, a woman who loved me, who raised me, but also said racist things that made me cringe. And what he's doing there is, I think he's saying to Americans, actually, it's weirdly an anti-cancel culture speech before there was such a thing, but he's saying, look in our own families and communities, like none of us is perfect. And in fact, if we only choose to see the bad in each other, we can never come together to actually make progress in this country. And then he pulls back the lens and he talks about the Black experience of structural inequality, the education gap, the housing gap, the income gap. But then he talks about the white working class. And I think these lines really struck me today. He said, these are people that don't feel particularly privileged by their race. Their jobs have been shipped overseas. Their concerns about crime are dismissed as racism. He's really empathizing with people who would later become, I think, Trump voters. And the reason this kind of connects to both your recent, the last two questions, is that then Obama's making an argument that, hey, look, when we focus on these differences and we allow people to divide us by race or ethnicity, that's why we can't get affordable healthcare. That's why we can't build a coalition to kind of overcome special interests that stand in the way of progress. So he gets to the policy, he gets to the what at the end of the speech. He's running to make healthcare affordable. He's running to end the war in Iraq. He's running for a number of issues. But just as Roosevelt gave people a sense of a higher purpose, Obama gave people a vision of, hey, what would it be like if we weren't divided by things like race, but in fact chose to see the good in one another, or chose to empathize with one another, or chose to understand the fear that might lead somebody to say something that is offensive to you. And again, I think that the best politicians, and again, I'd say Reagan did this too, are able to give people a sense of a bigger national identity that is shared, and a bigger cause that leads into their agenda, instead of having an agenda that they're just trying to sell to people.
Yeah. I want to go back to the For Freedom speech for a second, though, because there's just reading that there was so much that stood out to me as being almost impossible to imagine being today. Both the focus of the speech, I mean, we see addresses to Congress that cover 7 different departments and 10 different initiatives, but also the honesty. Like there were parts of that speech where he would, FDR said, well, I'm here to tell you we're failing in this part of defense production, or
Yeah.
we're not meeting the goals that I had. Like, what was that? Just had he built up the trust? Was it the time, the medium? Like, how was he able to level set in that way?
I'm so glad you saw that. And I think it's a great lesson for today, because first of all, it's not unique to that speech. Like I spent, again, a lot of chapters just telling Roosevelt's story, and the trust he had from Americans is that he leveled with them. So at the height of the Depression, his whole point was like, hey, this is not going well. Like let me explain to you just how bad things are. There's not money in the banks. And so he had already built up a certain trust. This is a guy who will tell you the truth, and he'll explain it to you in language you can understand. That's the kind of fireside chat that he developed using radio, which was a kind of intimate form of communication. But you get to the For Freedom speech, and again, he is there to ask people to write a blank check of support for Britain, and again, like pretty much making clear, like, we're going to get involved in this war, and we have to, which was not popular with Americans. I mean, a few months before, that would have been, I don't know what the polls would have been, but it would certainly not have been a majority position. And what I was so struck by in reading that speech is it's a State of the Union address. And first of all, I was self-critical. I'm one of probably few human beings, maybe it's just not a good thing. Maybe it's about my own lack of advancement, but I worked on 8 of them, like 8 State of the Union. And every one you tried to find a different way to say, and the State of the Union is strong. And, everybody's got to applaud. FDR is like, it's not going well, people. Like the State of the Union is not good right now. Like the fascists are winning. We're behind in preparing for this war. The isolationists have kind of tied our hands. They're German spies here. Like he paints a pretty grim picture. And then you're right. Like when he gets to his defense program, which is kind of the meat of the speech, he's like, I got some bad news. We're kind of behind on building ships, or like, I don't have the exact language in front of me, but we're doing okay on this. And because I think he's so honest with people, they're like, well, this guy's telling the truth, and so then when he makes the argument for what he thinks needs to happen, I think he has more credibility. And then when he gives everything this lift of the 4 freedoms, it's like, that's what we're shooting for. Like we're here right now. We're not where we need to be. But because we stand for these things in the world, in this country and around the world, we're going to get our act together here, and everybody's going to do their part, whether you're working on a bomber assembly line or whether you're a taxpayer is just going to be kind of financing Britain's capacity to survive the Nazi onslaught, or whether you're someone who's going to end up probably being drafted and serving. And I think that if you bring it to today, we've lost that art of truth telling in political speech. Like people want to put the most positive spin on things, or politicians constantly want to tell you the best version of what they're doing. Or, Trump is the prices are down, like he'll literally say.
I was almost trying to imagine like the Fox News, story on FDR's speech. It would be like, President admits.
Yeah, President admits, yeah. And that's actually the thing. It's not just on the politicians. I think it's on the rest of us. Like we should reward truth telling. And we don't. I actually think more politicians would do it if they weren't so afraid to do it.
Yeah. You as you mentioned, you spent years as a White House speechwriter. The FDR chapter on Four Freedoms is the first time we hear about that as a profession, him meeting with a team of speechwriters. What is the history kind of behind that and having speechwriters working with electeds, with presidents in this way?
It's a great question. So, you know, from it was interesting going back and like again picking these speeches like before the 20th century. Presidents were not really the leading orators in this country. There were exceptions, Lincoln chief among them, but Lincoln would write his speeches. I mean, he wrote the Gettysburg Address, he wrote the second inaugural address. But most, and actually it's not that surprising because, there's no audio, there's no recorded audio, there's no obviously video. And so a speech is something you kind of give to some people in a room and it's reprinted. And actually the great speakers of the 19th century were people like Frederick Douglass or Anna Dickinson, who I have in the book, who are these people who just traveled around the country giving speeches. Like that was their job. And they give hundreds and hundreds of speeches a year. And they were kind of almost performers. Like that's not what presidents were. And so there were no White House speechwriters. You'd get help sometimes from people in your cabinet, like Lincoln on his first inaugural address had some help writing the speech from William Seward, his Secretary of State, but the idea that you have a department of the White House that is helping you figure out what to say didn't exist. The first White House speechwriter was in the Harding administration. So after World War I, and it was a guy named Judson Welliver. And I actually know that just because it's such a great name, Judson Welliver. But actually, even then, it was, not coincidentally, by the way, this is the time when radio has been invented. And one of the things I really kind of learned in writing the book is how much technology has shaped how people speak, because I think once presidents are like, oh, wait a second, like what I say is going to be beamed into households across the country, I better take this more seriously, essentially. And so you start to have this role of White House speechwriter. But then FDR is the first one who truly kind of professionalized it. And he had, at any given time, multiple speechwriters, which has obviously been the case ever since. But he even did things really interesting, like for the Four Freedoms speech, one of the speechwriters on that speech was a guy named Robert Sherwood, who was a Pulitzer Prize winning playwright. I mean, he was like a hugely accomplished writer. And Roosevelt essentially drafted him in 1940 during his reelection campaign because he knew Sherwood was deeply anti-fascist, and he kind of appealed to his, not just his patriotism, but his desire to help Roosevelt stand up to Hitler, and so suddenly you have not just a professionalization, but an idea that these words like a president speaks really matter. And then you get television. And so the words matter even more because that is performance. Like radio is, I need to explain things very clearly. I need to make arguments. I need to maybe have a big vision like the Four Freedoms. But by the time you get to John F. Kennedy and people are watching these speeches, well, that's when you get, Ted Sorensen, probably the most famous White House speechwriter, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Like there's an understanding that when the president speaks, the spectacle will matter. Like what will people see? Like how will the crowd react? How charismatic is the speech going to appear? And that, I think becomes in many ways this kind of golden age of presidential speaking. And it's no coincidence that the most presidential speeches, the majority of the presidential speeches I have are from this era, from like Kennedy through Obama, when it's television and people are watching these speeches and there's a performance to them. Then the internet comes along. And interestingly, the internet and social media has kind of destroyed the art of this because now nobody watches a whole speech. They watch bits and pieces and clips that are kind of algorithmically delivered to you to kind of trigger you. And Trump is perfect for this because he can give a 1 hour, incoherent in some ways rant. And yet it's tremendously effective because most people are consuming on social media. And so his supporters are getting clips delivered that they love because they're funny, or they, pick on people they don't like, or they just say things in a very visceral way, or he's angering his opponents, and so actually we're living through a time of regression in terms of how presidents and politicians speak. I would argue, and I do argue, that that's part of what's gone wrong in our politics. Part of the reason that Americans feel like what is going on is that there's nobody telling them what's going on. Speeches used to be the way that presidents told us what was happening. Like, my earliest memories of politics are like Ronald Reagan, who, again, not my brand of politics, but if something happened, the Challenger exploded, like, well, he'd tell you what happened in a very beautiful way. And, or, if he was making the case for his policies, he did it, remarkably well. We've lost that, and I think that's part of the reason why people kind of feel like there's no compass.
Yeah. I mean, even when you think about traditions like the State of the Union, it's almost now devolved into like micro performances where it's Pelosi ripping up the speech, or Biden having a 10-second exchange with a heckler. How does that change the job of someone like yourself, devoted to kind of the long form speech writing and the longer form telling of stories? Or does it need to adapt?
So it's such a great question. Every year, to take you behind the curtain a little bit, Obama would say, like, I don't want to give the traditional State of the Union. Like, I want to just get up there and tell a story. Like, I want it to be short. I want it to be an argument, because the best Obama speeches, of which there are many, and I didn't work on all of them, were stories. It was him, again, like, there was a formula to the good ones. It was like, how did we get here? Where are we? Like, what does it all mean? Where might we go? And then he tells you where to go. The State of the Union, even under Obama, those were not our best speeches. I mean, we try to have like a good ending, and we'd have some theme, so we try to make it a story. But you're right. Even under Obama, who I think is the best presidential speaker easily of the 21st century, it started to become, we're going to have someone up in the box. We're all going to say, look at John Doe, the hero who, 3 weeks ago, saved a woman from being hit by a train. I don't want to pick on anyone, but like, it was these kind of made for TV moments, and then people would heckle him, and that would be a moment, and everybody's counting how many times people stand up and applaud, and did the Republicans applaud or just the Democrats? And there was a kind of, dumbing down, frankly, of how people. I mean, if you compare it to like that For Freedom speech, it's an incredibly dramatic moment where FDR tells America what it needs to do. I think look, I'm not a Luddite. I know we're never going to go back to like FDR, but I do think people are getting a little tired of the kind of cheap theatrics and, put downs or applause lines or focus group lines, right? Like bottom up, middle out. Like, people can smell inauthenticity. And I think that, like, the politicians I see starting to connect on the Democratic side, like a John Ossoff or James Tallarico, or, are people that are telling stories again and giving people a sense of their motivation. So my hope is actually there's a kind of counter programming to this era we've been through that is emerging.
Yeah, I'm going to get to some audience questions. I did want to ask you if there's any folks in today's landscape that kind of stand out, specifically with the kind of thread you talk about in the book as the ethos of striving and self-improvement, like people who are tapping into that in their speeches and storytelling. You mentioned Tallarico, Ossoff.
Yes, there are. And I'm going to very quickly tap into my charger.
Oh, of course. Yes. No problem. And I'm going to take this moment to remind everyone that
a little behind the scenes here.
Welcome. No problem. I'm going to take this moment to remind everyone that you're welcome to submit a question for Ben. You can do so in the YouTube chat, and then we will relay those questions. So we have one. Yeah.
So I was going to say, I'll give you 3 examples that I've been thinking about, who are conspicuously younger Democrats. But so I mentioned Ossoff, and some of these, clips have gone viral. But Ossoff is clearly someone who cares, like pays attention to like his speeches, and what he's doing that's working is he's telling a story about what is happening in the country that ties things together. I think the Democratic Party's been stuck for the last decade where it's like, do we talk about democracy issues, things that Trump is doing that threaten democracy, or do we talk about, kitchen table issues as if, these are separate things we have to choose between, like healthcare or authoritarianism or something. And what Ossoff is doing is he's getting up there and telling one story. He's saying it's about corruption, that there is a small group of people led by Donald Trump that is basically making the system just work for them. And that's why you cannot afford healthcare. That's why the prices are too high. That's why inequality is out of control. That's why we're in a war that Americans don't want to fight. And it seems simple, and it is, but it's actually not easy to do because it ties everything into kind of one story. And if we can solve the corruption and kind of take back the power from this collection of special interests and kind of oligarchs, that will then allow us to have the healthcare that you can afford and to make the changes in our economy that work for working people. And so what's interesting about Ossoff too is I mentioned it's going viral. Even if people don't watch the whole speech, a speech is where you work out your story. And so if you know your story, the story you're telling to voters, all your other things will be better, right? Your clips will be better. Your interviews will be better. Like we have it back. Like Obama used to, work on his through 2007. He was constantly refining his stump speech, the speech he gave every day, such that by he got time to 2008, when he win these primaries and give these like soaring speeches, well, the reason he could give those is he'd been working on it for a year, Yeah. And I think people forget that even if like not everybody's going to sit there and watch a 30-minute speech, if you nail it in that speech, all your other communication is going to be better. And I think Ossoff has demonstrated that. I think Tallarico, he's good at that, the why leading to the what, right? His faith compels him to care for his neighbor, which compels his politics. Like, he lets people into his sense of motivation. And another person, is AOC, is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And what she has, it's less the oratory, but it's the demeanor. She has, I think, what I would describe as a fearlessness and a joy in how she speaks when she's at these big rallies with, say, Bernie Sanders going around the country. The fearlessness is important because people can see they're throwing everything at her. Pretty powerful people are, and she's not afraid. And she's got a smile on her face. Yeah. Her politics looks fun. It's like, and this is something, Democratic politics has been kind of grim and angry the last 10 years. Like the 2008 Obama campaign was a lot of fun. And guess what? People wanted to be part of that. They wanted to knock on doors. They wanted to volunteer. And so I think, again, part of speaking is also just what energy are you projecting? And so I think those three people in different ways, and by the way, different ideological points on the spectrum are working through a way to communicate in this kind of post-social media age that I think could be effective.
Yeah. Let's get to some audience questions. Someone asked, during your time in the White House, what was the best part of your job? What was the most challenging part of your job?
Great question. The most challenging part, I worked in national security. And I was a speechwriter. And what that means is whatever the worst thing that was happening in the world or in America, like I'd have to work on, so on foreign policy, like if there's a bombing somewhere in the world or there's a civil war in Syria, like I'm going to be working on that. Or even as a speechwriter, though, like if there's a mass shooting in this country, I may have to write the statement. And so I don't want to say it's the worst part of the job, but it was the hardest part of the job was that you were kind of constantly engaging with really difficult and sometimes tragic events. And sometimes tragic events that were beyond your control. We couldn't stop a civil war on the other side of the world, or we obviously couldn't, stop gun violence in this country despite really trying hard. And And the best part of it, um, I mean, were two things. I mean, one was for me. I mean, to be like in terms of the function of the job, I loved traveling around the world with President Obama and helping him kind of tell a story about America that people around the world respected and looked up to. I used to love to write these big speeches he'd given in other countries because I felt like we were trying to tell the best story about America, and we were trying to inspire not just people in the rest of the world, but Americans to kind of believe in the best story of America. But at home, when there were those moments where I think Obama was able to break through the smallness of politics, I think about when he sang Amazing Grace in 2015 after the shooting at a black church, and there's a tragic moment, but to see the power of the presidency to give people hope or to heal, well, that's a pretty unique, I can do a lot of things out of government. I can't participate in that, and again, that connects to writing this book. I mean, those moments matter, and we don't really have them anymore.
Yeah. This question is more on your national security advisor hat. Can you share concerns you may have about the current administration's approach to foreign policy and specifically relationships with longtime ally countries?
I mean, we don't have time for that.
Yeah.
I just highlight a couple things though. And one goes out of Roosevelt, right? Like Roosevelt, I'm not saying America's always lived up to it. We've been hypocritical. I think, frankly, any nation is, particularly any superpower. But there was a values proposition, right? World War II was about defending the four freedoms. Now it's like open the effing strait and ship out the nuclear dust. And that connects to allies though, because the thing that linked us to our allies was that they believed in similar values, right? They were democracies, whether they were European or Asian, or potentially partners in Africa and Latin America. Like the idea of there is such a thing as a free world. Like there's that our relationships are not just transactional. Like with Trump, the relationships are purely transactional. And if you're not giving him what he wants, he doesn't care if you're a democracy. In fact, actually, that leads him to the second point. What's even more alarming is he seems to prefer the non-democratic countries. So it's not just that he kind of mistreats our allies and he doesn't speak about, values. It's that he seems to prefer the company of, Gulf monarchs or, Xi Jinping or some Vladimir Putin to, the Prime Minister of Canada or the, Chancellor of Germany or whoever it may be at the time. And I think that's a radical transformation. Because again, even if we didn't always get it right, now we're just pure transactionalism and we kind of prefer the autocrats to the Democrats. And boy, that's not a place that we want to stay for very long.
Yeah. If there's a director's cut of this book, maybe a 16th or a 17th speech, any that you left on the cutting room floor that you grappled with as you wrote?
Yeah, I mean, there were a bunch. There's one that I specifically had to leave on the cutting room floor. I actually had a chapter that I wrote on Pat Buchanan's 1992 speech to the Republican National Convention, which is known as the Culture War speech, which is a remarkable document because, Buchanan ran for president in 92, promising to build a wall on an America First platform, railing against free trade and supporting tariffs. It's very useful because there's this idea that Trump came out of nowhere. I think Buchanan points out that he didn't. I was not given permission to use that speech by Pat Buchanan, which you need for copyright purposes if it's within the last 80 years. But then I think for this crowd too, Commonwealth Club, like if there's a speech that I love that I couldn't use just because I already had King and Dolores Huerta from the 60s, I love Robert F. Kennedy's Day of Affirmation address in South Africa, which is shorthanded as the Ripples of Hope speech. If you know it, you probably know it because of the line that he has about sending out ripples of hope. But if you can go back and read that speech, it's actually the kind of most moral case I've heard for America's role in the world. That essentially he's framing it's not just the kind of cliche version of, we're for freedom and democracy. It's a grittier and yet beautiful invocation of the fact that there's a kind of moral purpose that America needs to embrace. And he's delivering this speech at the same time that he's kind of turning against the war in Vietnam, and he's delivering in South Africa, kind of implicitly aligning with the aspirations of Black South Africans. And so there's a radicalism. It's not just using the values language to justify whatever war we're in, which is, unfortunately what a lot of American presidents have done. So that's another one that in the director's cut, I would have loved to have been able to write about.
Yeah. We have some audience questions for aspiring speechwriters. What lessons have you learned throughout your career that you would impart to folks who are interested in pursuing this as a career? And can you talk about any other speechwriters that you admire or might recommend for others to check out?
Well, first of all, I think, if you're a speechwriter, you always have to remind you're writing for the person who's speaking, not yourself. So I had to spend a lot of time trying to get inside Barack Obama's head and his voice. I had to read everything he wrote. I read not just his books and speeches, but I would pore over his interview transcripts. And if he said something in an interview in an interesting way, I would literally take it and put it in a speech. The goal, your job is to help that person say what they want to say. And then in terms of what makes a speech good, I think the most important quality is authenticity. And I often say this to people, that the person delivering the speech should be the only person on earth who can deliver it. It has to, and that's why, again, in this book, I spent so much time in each chapter with the life story of the person, because I want to know, where did these words come from? Because that's what makes them powerful. That authenticity, that they're telling you something about their life or their experience or their motivation that is distinct. And that's what makes a connection to an audience, not a 5-point plan. I also think that, and this is something I really, encountered in writing the book, the most effective speeches also kind of tap into the power of movements. Obama very self-consciously spoke in the language of the civil rights movement. And people could kind of feel that intuitively, and it kind of gave his words more power. In the same way, frankly, that Trump built a movement, and his words, reflect that, although it's very much his own movement. The last thing I'd say is that in this day and age, this is kind of a new piece of advice, but it connects to the authenticity point. I think with artificial intelligence and kind of this, sea of slop that we consume every day, the personal voice is more important than ever. I think people really want to feel like they know the person speaking to them. Who are they? And again, it ties to authenticity, but I'd be sharing more, share vulnerability, right? Be vulnerable. And this is kind of counter programming Trump. There's no vulnerability. I actually think people are ready to hear someone wrestle with their doubts or share their own evolution, how they changed their mind, things they might have been wrong about in the past. I think that we may be entering a new phase coming out of Trump because oftentimes the best communication kind of is totally counter to the previous person's, and I think that if I was a speechwriter on a presidential campaign, today or a year from now, I'd be looking at ways to work that in.
We're going to have to leave our conversation there. Ben Rhodes, thank you so much for your time this evening.
Thanks. It was great, Guy. I really enjoyed talking to you. Great questions.
Thank you so much. Well, our thanks again to Ben Rhodes. He is the author of All We Say, The Battle for American Identity, A History in 15 Speeches. We encourage everyone to pick up a copy of Ben's new book at your local bookstore. And if you'd like to become a member and support the Commonwealth Club's efforts in making virtual and in-person programming possible, please visit commonwealthclub.org. I'm Guy Marzorati. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and take care.